I remember feeling confused when my father said that, because I knew what I had seen. The next night, it rained again, and once more, I stood by the living room window. I looked across the road. The old man was sitting there exactly where he had been before, still, silent, waiting. That was when I decided to tell someone else. The following afternoon, I spoke to our neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who had lived on that road much longer than we had. When I described the man sitting on the porch, she stopped what she was doing and looked at me very carefully. Then she told me something I never forgot. She said the old man who used to live in that house had passed away many years earlier, long before my parents and I had ever moved there. She told me his chair had stayed on the porch for a long time after he was gone. No one ever moved it. No one ever took it away. After that conversation, I stopped looking out the window at night. I didn't want to see the porch anymore. A few weeks later, my parents decided we were going to move to another house in a different part of town. I never told them the real reason I was relieved to leave, but I remember the last night before we moved. It was raining again, and before going to sleep, I looked across the road one last time. The porch was empty. The chair was still there, but the old man was gone. After that night, I never saw anything like that again. At first, I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that night. I remember standing there for several minutes, watching the porch across the road through the rain, trying to understand why someone would be sitting there in a house that everyone said was empty. The old man didn't move. He didn't shift in the chair. He didn't turn his head. He just sat there facing the road as if he had been sitting there long before I noticed him. After a while, my mother called me from the kitchen, and when I looked back at the window again, I couldn't see him anymore. The chair was still there, but the porch was empty. The next evening, it rained again. I found myself standing near the same window without really thinking about it. I looked across the road, and the old man was there again, sitting in the same chair, in the same position, perfectly still. This time, I watched him longer, long enough to notice that there were no lights inside the house behind him, no movement in the windows, no car near the fence, nothing that suggested anyone was living there at all. It didn't feel like he had just arrived. It felt like he had always been there. A few nights later, I finally told my parents what I had been seeing. My father looked out the window himself. He stood there for a moment, quietly watching the porch. Then he turned back toward me and said something that confused me at the time. He told me the house had been empty for years, and there was no one sitting on that porch. My name is Michael, and when I was a child, my parents and I lived in a quiet house at the end of a narrow country road. It wasn't a busy place. Most nights, the only sound I could hear after sunset was the rain tapping softly against my bedroom window, and the occasional car passing far in the distance. Across the road from our house, there was another house. Everyone in the neighborhood called it the abandoned house. It sat there quietly behind a short wooden fence that leaned slightly to one side, with tall grass growing around the porch steps and paint slowly peeling from the walls year after year. Even during the daytime, it always looked darker than the rest of the houses nearby. My parents once told me that an old man used to live there many years earlier. They said he lived alone for a very long time. I never knew his name, By the time we moved into our house, the place across the road had already been empty for years. At least, that's what I believe. One rainy evening when I was about 11 years old, I was standing near the living room window watching the road outside. The rain was falling slowly, almost gently, and the porch across the street was barely visible in the dim light coming from our house. That was when I noticed something I had never seen before. There was someone sitting in a chair on the porch of the abandoned house. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became. There was an old man sitting there, and he wasn't moving at all. Now, let's move on to the next story. My name is Ethan Miller, and this happened a few years ago when I was living alone in a small rental house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus. It wasn't a large house, just a narrow living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom facing the backyard. Most evenings followed the same routine. I would come home from work around 6, make something simple for dinner, and spend the rest of the night finishing paperwork or watching television until I started feeling tired. That particular week had been unusually calm. It was late spring, and the nights were warm enough that I often left one of the windows slightly open so I could hear the crickets outside. One Saturday evening, I stayed up later than usual, finishing a report for work. By the time I finally turned off the living room light, the house was completely quiet. I remember checking the clock in the hallway. It was a little after 11:30 p.m. I had just reached my bedroom and was about to lie down when I heard it. 3 slow knocks. They came from the front door, not loud, not rushed, just 3 careful knocks spaced evenly apart. At first, I thought maybe someone had the wrong house. That happened sometimes in the neighborhood. So I walked back down the hallway and turned on the porch light. When I opened the door, the street outside was empty. No car, no footsteps, no one walking away. The road in front of my house was completely still. I stood there for a few seconds listening, expecting maybe someone to call out or come back. But nothing happened. Eventually, I closed the door and turned the lock. I told myself it was probably just someone passing by. Still, before going back to bed, I checked the clock again. It was exactly 11:37 p.m. The next night followed the same routine as always. Dinner, television, quiet house. And again, just as I was getting ready to sleep, I heard the same 3 knocks. Slow, evenly spaced, careful. This time, I didn't check the hallway clock right away. Instead, I stood still in my bedroom doorway, listening. There were no footsteps afterward, no voices, no sound of someone leaving the porch. Just silence. After a moment, I walked to the front door again and turned on the porch light. The street was empty, exactly like the night before. When I checked the clock in the hallway, it read 11:37 p.m., the same time as the previous night. That was when the knocking started to feel different. Not random, not accidental, intentional. Over the next few nights, it kept happening. Always 3 knocks, always at 11:37 p.m., always with no one outside. By the 4th night, I decided to mention it to my neighbor across the street while we were both getting the mail in the afternoon. He listened carefully while I explained what had been happening. Then he asked me something unexpected. He asked if the knocks always came in groups of 3. When I said yes, he nodded slowly. After a moment, he told me the previous tenant who lived in my house had once complained about hearing knocking late at night too. He had moved out not long after that. At the time, no one in the neighborhood understood why, until something happened one night. Something no one ever really explained. I asked my neighbor what he meant by that, but instead of answering directly, he just said something I still remember very clearly. He told me to stop opening the door when the knocking started. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual. I kept the lights on in the living room and watched the clock carefully as it got closer to 11:37 p.m. The house felt quieter than normal. Even the crickets outside seemed softer. When the time finally came, the knocking happened again. 3 slow knocks, exactly the same as before. This time, I didn't move. I stayed where I was sitting and waited. After a few seconds, something else happened. Very gently, the doorknob moved. Not enough to open the door, just enough to make the lock shift slightly in place, as if someone outside had tried to turn it once, then stopped. I didn't go near the door that night, and after that, I never opened it again when the knocking started. A few weeks later, I decided to move to a different apartment closer to work. On my last night in the house, I stayed awake again until 11:37 p.m. I told myself that if the knocking happened one more time, I would ignore it like before. But that night, the house stayed completely quiet. There were no knocks, no movement at the door, nothing at all. Even now, years later, I still check the clock sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, and every once in a while, it's exactly 11:37 p.m. Now, let's move on to the next story. My name is Lucas Bennett, and this happened during the first winter I spent living alone after moving into a small rented house just outside a quiet neighborhood in western Ohio. The house wasn't new. It had narrow hallways, wooden floors that made soft sounds when the temperature changed at night, and older windows that sometimes let in a faint draft when the wind picked up after sunset. Still, it was comfortable. Most evenings followed the same routine. I would come home from work around 5, make something simple for dinner, and spend the rest of the night reading or watching television before heading to bed around 11. By late December, the nights had become very quiet. Snow covered most of the yard behind the house, and the streets nearby stayed empty after dark. One Saturday night, I stayed awake longer than usual, finishing a book I had been reading all week. It was close to midnight when I finally turned off the living room lamp and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. That was when I noticed something unusual. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house. Not freezing, just noticeably colder. At first I assumed one of the windows near the back of the house might not have been fully closed. So before going to bed, I walked back toward the kitchen to check. Everything was shut. Everything looked normal. I remember standing there for a moment, listening to how quiet the house sounded that night. Then, just as I reached my bedroom door again, I heard a slow step behind me. Not loud, not rushed. Just one careful step on the wooden floor in the hallway, and I knew I was the only person inside the house. At first, I stayed completely still. I told myself it was probably just the floor adjusting to the cold weather. Older houses made sounds like that sometimes. Still, I listened carefully. The hallway behind me stayed quiet. After a few seconds, I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door halfway before turning off the light. For a while, nothing else happened, but sometime later that night, I woke up again. I didn't know what time it was. The house was completely dark, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it again. Another slow step in the hallway, this time closer. It sounded exactly like someone walking carefully across the wooden floor outside my bedroom. I sat up in bed and listened. The step stopped just outside my door. I waited for the handle to move, but it didn't. Instead, after a few seconds, I heard another step, then another, moving slowly down the hallway toward the living room, as if someone had just walked past my bedroom. The next morning, I checked every room in the house before leaving for work. Nothing was out of place. All the doors were still locked. All the windows were closed. Later that afternoon, I mentioned what I had heard to the woman who lived next door while we were both clearing snow near the sidewalk. She listened quietly. Then she asked me how long I had been hearing footsteps in the hallway. Her question surprised me because I hadn't told her about the sound from the night before. I asked what she meant. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Then she told me the family who lived in the house before me had once said they sometimes heard someone walking through the hallway late at night, always slowly, always after midnight. They had assumed it was just the house settling, at least at first, until one night they heard the footsteps stop outside their bedroom door, just like I had. After that, they moved a few months later. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual again. I left the bedroom door slightly open and kept the hallway light off so I could listen more carefully. The house felt quiet, colder than before. Sometime after midnight, the footsteps returned, slow, even, careful, moving down the hallway exactly the same way as before. This time, they stopped right outside my door. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I just listened. After a few seconds, something else happened. Very gently, my bedroom door moved slightly farther open. Not fast, not suddenly. Just enough to change the angle of the shadow in the hallway. I stayed awake the rest of the night. A few weeks later, I moved into a different apartment, closer to town. Sometimes I still think about that hallway during the winter. And even now, I don't like sleeping with my bedroom door open anymore.